The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning, its soft ticking a cruel metronome counting the seconds of a life unraveling. On the cold laminate floor, a 30-year-old woman named Naomi Clarke lay in a shattered heap, the world reduced to a universe of pain radiating from her leg. It was broken, a jagged, blinding agony that eclipsed the constellation of bruises blooming across her skin. Through the haze of shock, she could see her mother, Cheryl, standing by the kitchen counter, her silhouette framed by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Her face was a mask of placid observation, as still and unmoving as a portrait. Just watching. Naomi's gaze shifted to the man standing over her, his chest heaving not from exertion but from the thrill of power. Her stepfather, Marcus Vance. His shadow fell over her like a shroud. A whispered, broken plea escaped Naomi's lips, a sound swallowed by the suffocating silence of the room. "Mom, please." But her mother just watched. In that moment, Naomi understood a terrifying truth. She was utterly alone. But what Marcus, in his arrogant rage, and Cheryl, in her glacial indifference, could never know was that the woman they were breaking on the floor possessed something they could never touch. A quiet, unbreakable core forged in a life of hardship, and a secret knowledge that would soon become her weapon. The world believed she was nothing, but they were about to witness how the woman who had nothing left to lose would end up taking everything from them. Naomi's life had not always been this landscape of hushed terror and tiptoed survival. She remembered a time when the house was filled with laughter, the warm, booming sound of her father's voice echoing through the halls. They didn't have much, but they had a richness of spirit that money couldn't buy. Her father, a simple mechanic with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, had always told her she had healing hands. He'd watched her tend to scraped knees and sick birds with a gentle patience that seemed innate. He was the one who encouraged her to enroll in nursing school, saving every spare dollar in a coffee can labeled Naomi's future. She had been 2 years into her degree, her mind brimming with medical terminology and the quiet thrill of caring for others, when a sudden heart attack had stolen him from her. The light in the house went out that day, and a creeping cold began to settle in. Her mother, Cheryl, had never been a warm woman, but without her husband's sunny disposition to balance her, she became brittle, lost. And into that void stepped Marcus Vance. He arrived with a dazzling smile, a tailored suit, and promises of security. He was a small-time real estate developer with a big-time ego, and he swept Cheryl off her feet. To the outside world, he was a savior, a charming man who had rescued a grieving widow. But behind closed doors, the charm curdled into control. It began subtly. A comment about Naomi's friends, a suggestion she drop out of nursing school to help with expenses, a tightening of the household budget that left Naomi with no money of her own. He said it was temporary, a way to build their new life together. But the temporary measures became permanent fixtures. Naomi, wanting to support her mother and honor the memory of the peace her father had cherished, agreed. She took a job as a janitor at a downtown office building, the sterile scent of cleaning chemicals replacing the antiseptic smell of hospital wards she had dreamed of. Her scrubs were traded for a drab gray uniform, her future exchanged for a bucket and mop. The control soon spiraled into a campaign of quiet cruelty. Marcus delighted in humiliating her. He would mock her janitor's uniform in front of his friends, calling her Cinderella with a sneer that never reached his eyes. He criticized her cooking, her appearance, her very presence. He made her a ghost in her own home, a servant whose only purpose was to exist for his convenience. And Cheryl, caught in the web of Marcus's financial support and terrified of being alone again, became his silent accomplice. She adopted his opinions, echoed his criticisms, and averted her eyes whenever his cruelty sharpened its edges. She allowed the memory of Naomi's father and the dreams they had shared to be paved over by Marcus's suffocating influence. Naomi endured it all with a quiet dignity that infuriated Marcus. Her resilience was a silent rebellion, a refusal to be broken that he seemed determined to conquer. He saw her quiet strength not as a virtue, but as a challenge to his authority. And so, the emotional torment began to bleed into physical threats. A slammed door, a gripped arm, a menacing step forward. Each incident was a test, pushing the boundary a little further, and each time Cheryl's silence gave him permission to escalate. Tonight had been the culmination of it all. The trigger was laughably small. Naomi had accidentally spilled a glass of water on some of his real estate papers. It was a simple mistake, but for a man like Marcus, who saw the world as an extension of his own will, it was a declaration of war. The fury in his eyes had been immediate and terrifying. He had backhanded her, the shock of the blow sending her stumbling backward. And then the rage had truly taken hold. He had kicked her, and she had fallen, her leg twisting beneath her at an unnatural angle. The snap of the bone was a sound she would never forget, a sickening crack that echoed louder than his shouts. And through it all, as she begged for her mother to intervene, Cheryl had simply stood there, a silent spectator at the dismantling of her own daughter. That was the moment something inside Naomi finally gave way. It wasn't her bone that had truly broken. It was the last, frayed thread of hope that her mother would ever protect her. Lying on that floor, drowning in a sea of pain and betrayal, she knew she had to leave. It was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. Survival. With a surge of adrenaline that defied the agony in her leg, Naomi began to move. She waited until Marcus, his rage spent, had stormed off to bed, leaving her on the floor like a discarded object. She waited until she heard the faint sound of her mother finally retreating to her own room, the soft click of the door a final act of abandonment. Every movement was a fresh wave of torture. She used her arms to drag her useless leg across the floor, gritting her teeth against the scream that was clawing its way up her throat. She slid past the living room, past the framed photo of her and her father smiling on a long-forgotten vacation. His eyes seemed to urge her on. She reached the front door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. The cold night air hit her face like a slap, a shocking jolt of reality. She was out. She was free. But she was also broken, bleeding, and had nowhere to go. She pulled herself down the front steps, leaving a small, dark trail behind her, and began to crawl towards the distant glow of the streetlights, a wounded animal escaping a predator's den, not knowing if she was crawling towards safety or simply a different kind of darkness. The city at 3 a.m. is a lonely, indifferent beast. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, and the world is hushed, save for the distant siren or the hum of a passing car. For Naomi, this world was a blur of pain and desperation. She had managed to drag herself a few blocks, her broken leg a dead weight of torment. She found a small alcove behind some overflowing trash cans in a dark alley, a pathetic attempt at shelter. The cold from the concrete seeped into her bones, and her body shivered uncontrollably, a combination of shock and the frigid night air. She had no phone, no money, no one to call. The people she should have been able to rely on were the very monsters she had just escaped. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She was at the absolute nadir of her existence, a point of such profound hopelessness that it felt like the end. She thought about giving up, about just closing her eyes and letting the cold take her. But then, the image of her father's smiling face flashed in her mind. He had never given up on anything. He had worked until his hands were raw to provide for them, to fund her dream. His legacy was one of resilience, and in that moment, in the darkest alley of her life, she clung to it like a life raft. As dawn began to break, painting the edges of the sky in shades of gray and bruised purple, Naomi heard a sudden cry of pain from the mouth of the alley. It was a sharp, guttural sound, followed by a heavy thud. Peeking from her hiding spot, she saw an elderly man clutch his chest and collapse onto the pavement. He was dressed in a simple, worn coat and leaned heavily on a cane, which now lay a few feet from his outstretched hand. People walked by on the main street, their faces buried in their phones or shielded by the collars of their coats, oblivious or uncaring. They saw a heap on the ground and simply gave it a wide berth, perhaps assuming he was just another homeless person. But Naomi saw something else. She saw the panicked look in his eyes, the bluish tint forming around his lips, the way his hand was desperately grasping at his chest. The 2 years of nursing school, buried under a decade of humiliation and drudgery, came rushing back to the forefront of her mind. This was not a drill. This was not a textbook. This was a human life slipping away. Forgetting her own agony for a moment, she acted. Every instinct screamed at her to help. Using a discarded piece of wood as a crude crutch, she hobbled out of the alley, her broken leg sending shards of fire up her body with every excruciating step. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" she called out, her voice raspy. The man's eyes fluttered open, wide with fear. He couldn't speak, only gasp. She knelt beside him, a difficult and painful maneuver. She checked his pulse. It was faint and erratic. She noted his labored breathing, classic signs of a major cardiac event. "Somebody call 911, she screamed at the indifferent passers-by, her voice raw with urgency. A few people glanced over, annoyed at the disturbance, before moving on. There was no time. She had to do something. She remembered her professors, their voices clear in her head. Maintain the airway. Loosen tight clothing. She unbuttoned the man's collar and gently tilted his head back. "Sir, I'm here to help you. My name is Naomi. I have some medical training," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos within her own body. She spoke to him soothingly, trying to keep him from panicking, knowing that stress on the heart would only make things worse. His breathing hitched, and then it stopped. His eyes rolled back. No pulse. Naomi didn't hesitate. She began CPR. Interlacing her fingers, she placed her hands on the center of his chest and began compressions, counting aloud to keep a steady rhythm. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The pain in her leg was a roaring inferno, but she pushed it away, compartmentalizing it. All that mattered was the rhythm, the force, the desperate act of pushing life back into a body that was trying to quit. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with her tears. She was a broken, homeless woman in a dirty alley, performing a life-saving procedure on a stranger. It was a surreal, desperate tableau. After 2 cycles of compressions, she checked again. A faint, fluttering heartbeat. He coughed, a weak, sputtering sound, and began to breathe again on his own, shallowly but breathing nonetheless. It was at that moment that the wail of a siren finally cut through the morning air. Paramedics rushed over, their faces a mixture of surprise and professional focus as they saw the scene. "We got a call about a woman screaming," one of them said, before his eyes took in the old man on the ground and Naomi, pale and trembling, hovering over him. He went into cardiac arrest. "I performed CPR until he started breathing again," she explained, her voice barely a whisper. The paramedics took over with swift efficiency, loading the man onto a stretcher. One of them turned to Naomi. "You saved his life. Another minute, and it would have been too late. Where did you learn to do that?" Before she could answer, the pain in her leg, which had been held at bay by adrenaline, came crashing back with a vengeance. The world tilted, the colors blurred, and she collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving pavement. Naomi awoke to the smell of antiseptic and the soft, rhythmic beep of a machine. She was in a hospital bed, her leg encased in a heavy cast and elevated on a pillow. The thin, scratchy blanket felt like the finest silk. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was safe. A kind-faced nurse came in and explained that the paramedics who had treated the elderly man had insisted on bringing her in as well. They had diagnosed her with a severely fractured tibia, along with dehydration and exhaustion. As the nurse spoke, a wave of reality washed over Naomi. She was safe for now, but what happened when they discharged her? She had nothing. No home, no money, no one. The despair she had felt in the alley began to creep back in. She had saved a life, but she had no idea how to save her own. She spent 2 days in the hospital, a brief, sterile respite from the chaos of her life. On the 3rd day, just as she was starting to panic about her impending release, a visitor appeared at her door. He was a man in an impeccably tailored suit, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He introduced himself as Arthur Sinclair, the personal attorney for a Mr. Theodore Hawthorne. Naomi stared at him, confused. "I don't know anyone by that name," she said. Arthur Sinclair smiled. "I believe you do. He was the gentleman you assisted in the alley 3 days ago." Naomi's eyes widened. The old man in the worn coat. Is he okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "He is," Arthur replied. "Thanks to you. He is recovering well. Mr. Hawthorne is an exceedingly private man, which is why he was dressed so modestly that morning. He enjoys early morning walks without the usual fanfare that follows him. He is also, as it happens, one of the wealthiest men in this city." The words hung in the air, seeming too fantastic to be real. Arthur continued, "Mr. Hawthorne is a man who believes in repaying his debts, and he considers the saving of his life to be a debt of immeasurable value. He has instructed me to handle all of your medical expenses, of course. But that is merely the beginning. He has also asked me to extend an offer to you. He is in need of a full-time, live-in companion and caregiver during his recovery. The position comes with a generous salary, private accommodations at his estate, and a guarantee of your personal safety. Naomi was speechless. It felt like a dream, a fairy tale spun in the drab reality of a hospital room. An escape, a new life. It was more than she could have ever dared to hope for. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the lawyer. Why? Why would he do all this for me? Arthur's expression softened. Because when he was at his most vulnerable, when the world walked past him and left him to die, you, a person who had every reason to be consumed by your own suffering, chose to show him compassion. He told me, a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those who can do nothing for them. In that moment, Miss Clarke, you could do nothing for him, and yet you gave him everything. He feels he is the one who is in your debt. With a trembling voice, Naomi accepted. She had walked out of her old life with nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken body. Now, because of a single act of kindness, she was being offered a world she had never imagined. As she was wheeled out of the hospital and into a luxurious black car, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. The Hawthorne estate was not a house. It was a kingdom, tucked away behind a towering stone wall and a formidable iron gate. It was a sprawling mansion surrounded by acres of manicured gardens that looked like something out of a magazine. As the car crunched up the long, winding driveway, Naomi stared out the window in awe. It was a world away from the cramped, oppressive house she had escaped. It was a world of impossible beauty and tranquility. Mr. Hawthorne, whose real name was Theodore, greeted her in a grand library filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the warm scent of old paper and lemon polish. He was no longer the frail, terrified man from the alley. He sat in a plush armchair, a blanket over his lap, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, filled with a warmth that immediately put Naomi at ease. He had a gentle, grandfatherly air about him. "Miss Clarke," he said, his voice a soft, cultured rumble. "It is an honor to finally meet the angel who saved my life." Naomi blushed, feeling awkward and out of place in her hospital-issued sweatpants amidst such opulence. "Please, call me Naomi. And I'm no angel, sir. I just did what anyone should have done." Theodore smiled wistfully. "Ah, but they didn't, did they? You did. And for that, I am eternally grateful." A new life began for Naomi. She was given a beautiful suite of rooms, larger than the entire ground floor of her old house, with a balcony overlooking a rose garden. The staff, from the kind-hearted housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, to Theodore's stern but loyal personal driver, were all instructed to treat her with the utmost respect. Her duties were simple. She helped Theodore with his recovery exercises, managed his medication schedule, her nursing knowledge proving invaluable, read to him in the evenings, and, most importantly, provided companionship. They would spend hours talking in the library, Naomi sharing stories of her father and her dreams of being a nurse, and Theodore recounting tales of his life, of building a business empire from nothing. He was a widower with no children, a man who had all the money in the world but had been profoundly lonely. In Naomi, he found a kindred spirit, someone whose goodness and resilience shone through her quiet demeanor. He saw not a victim, but a survivor of incredible strength. He didn't just give her a job. He gave her a sanctuary where she could begin to heal, both physically and emotionally. The nightmares about Marcus and the beating began to fade, replaced by peaceful nights and days filled with purpose. She started to smile again, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She discovered she had a keen mind for organization, and soon she was not just managing Theodore's medical schedule, but helping to organize his philanthropic calendars and correspondence. Theodore was impressed. "You have a mind for logistics, my dear," he'd said one afternoon. "A sharp, orderly brain. It's a shame it was wasted scrubbing floors." For the first time, Naomi felt seen. She felt valued not just for her kindness, but for her intelligence. She was more than a servant, more than a victim. She was becoming herself again. But the past has a long shadow, and just as Naomi began to believe she had truly escaped it, it came roaring back into her life. About a month into her new life, a local news station ran a human interest story. It was about the reclusive billionaire Theodore Hawthorne and his miraculous recovery from a near-fatal heart attack. The piece lauded the mystery Samaritan, a heroic stranger who had saved his life. And accompanying the article was a grainy still from a nearby security camera. It was a blurry image of a woman with dark skin, her face obscured, performing CPR on a man in an alleyway. For most of the city, it was a heartwarming but anonymous story. But for two people, in a small, suffocating house across town, it was a thunderbolt. Marcus Vance stared at the newspaper, his knuckles white as he gripped the page. He recognized the alley. He recognized the desperate posture. Even blurry, he knew it was her. He had assumed she had crawled off to some shelter, or worse. The thought that she had not only survived, but had somehow stumbled into the orbit of one of the city's richest men sent a wave of apoplectic rage through him. It was an affront to his power, a mockery of his control. Cheryl peered over his shoulder, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning, greedy realization. Their victim, the worthless girl they had thrown away, had fallen into a gold mine. The first contact was a letter. Addressed to Naomi, it arrived in her mother's spidery, hesitant handwriting. It was filled with flimsy apologies and pleas for forgiveness, woven with subtle mentions of their financial struggles and how proud they were of her. Naomi read it with a cold knot in her stomach. The words were hollow, a transparent attempt to manipulate her. She showed the letter to Theodore, who read it with a grim expression. "This is not an apology, my dear," he said gently. "This is an invoice. They believe you owe them something." He was right. Naomi tore the letter up and threw it away. She would not be drawn back into their web. But Marcus was not a man who gave up easily. When the letter failed, the phone calls began. He left messages with the estate staff, his voice a sickening blend of false concern and underlying menace. "Tell Naomi her mother is sick with worry," he'd say. "We just want to know she's safe." The staff, under Theodore's strict orders, politely but firmly rebuffed him every time. This only fueled Marcus's fury. He saw Naomi's silence not as a desire to be left alone, but as a calculated slight, orchestrated by her new benefactor. His jealousy and paranoia grew into a dangerous obsession. He began to see Theodore Hawthorne not as Naomi's savior, but as his rival, a man who had stolen his property. He started a smear campaign. He called old family friends, neighbors, anyone who would listen, spinning a tale of a troubled, mentally unstable stepdaughter who had run away and was now taking advantage of a wealthy old man. He painted himself as the worried father, desperate to save his confused daughter from a predatory situation. Some people believed him. Whispers started to circulate. The situation escalated when Marcus, in a fit of arrogant desperation, decided to confront them directly. He drove to the Hawthorne estate and demanded to be let in, screaming at the security guards at the gate that he was there to see his daughter. When he was denied entry, he caused a scene, his shouts echoing in the quiet, affluent neighborhood. The incident made Theodore realize that Marcus was not just a contemptible bully, but a genuine threat to Naomi's safety and peace of mind. "We cannot allow this man to terrorize you any longer," Theodore said, his voice firm. "Men like him only understand one thing: consequences." He summoned his lawyer, Arthur Sinclair, and a team of the best private investigators in the city. "I want you to find out everything there is to know about Marcus Vance," Theodore instructed them. "His business dealings, his personal history, every skeleton in his closet. I want to know where he buys his coffee and what brand of toothpaste he uses. Leave no stone unturned." And so, while Marcus was busy trying to tear down Naomi's new life from the outside, a quiet, methodical army was beginning to dismantle his from the inside out. They uncovered a history of shady real estate deals, of cutting corners, of bullying smaller contractors into bankruptcy. They found whispers of other instances of aggression, of a temper that flared when he didn't get his way. But the real bombshell was hidden deep in his financial records. A pattern of fraud, of shell corporations and laundered money, a complex scheme designed to cheat both his investors and the government. Marcus Vance, the man who projected an image of success and power, was a common crook, his entire life built on a foundation of lies. While the investigation was underway, Marcus escalated his attacks. He began stalking the estate, parking his car down the street for hours, watching. He tried to get to Naomi through other means, sending her manipulative text messages from her mother's phone. "Naomi, please come home. I miss you. Marcus is sorry, he's just stressed." Each message was a small, poisoned dart, designed to prick at old wounds of guilt and obligation. Naomi, with Theodore's unwavering support, found the strength to ignore them. She was changing. The quiet, timid woman who had once scrubbed floors was being replaced by someone more confident, more assured. Working alongside Theodore, she was discovering her own worth. She was intelligent, capable, and kind. She was a survivor. One evening, Theodore called her into the library. On the large mahogany desk were stacks of files and documents. It was the complete investigation into Marcus Vance. "It's time you saw the man you were living with for who he truly is," Theodore said gently. Naomi spent hours reading, her initial shock turning to a cold, hard anger. The abuse she had endured was not just a personal failing. It was part of a pattern of a man who preyed on the vulnerable in every aspect of his life. Seeing the evidence laid out so clinically, so undeniably, severed the last, microscopic vestiges of any complicated feelings she had. There was no room for pity or confusion, only a clear, righteous certainty. He had to be stopped. The final confrontation was not one Naomi sought, but one that Marcus forced upon her. Driven to the brink by his failing businesses and the tightening net of Theodore's investigation, he made a final, desperate move. He found a way to bypass the main gate security, scaling a low wall at the back of the estate under the cover of darkness. He was a man unhinged, fueled by rage and a sense of entitlement that bordered on insanity. He believed that if he could just get to Naomi, he could reassert his control, either through threats or through force. He broke into the house through a patio door, his movements clumsy and loud. An alarm immediately blared through the mansion, a piercing shriek that shattered the night's tranquility. Theodore's security team was on him in seconds, but not before he managed to storm his way towards the library, where he knew Naomi and Theodore often spent their evenings. Naomi and Theodore were in the middle of a chess game when the alarms went off. Theodore's hand, holding a white knight, froze midair. Then they heard the shouting. Marcus's voice, raw and furious, echoed down the hall. "Naomi, get out here. You think you can hide from me behind this old man's money?" Before security could stop him, he burst into the library. His face was contorted in a mask of pure rage, his eyes wild. He looked from Theodore's calm, steely gaze to Naomi. He saw her not in a janitor's uniform, but in a simple, elegant dress, her hair done, her face composed. She was not cowering. She was standing tall, her chin up, a silent fire in her eyes. The transformation infuriated him. "You think you're better than us now?" he spat, taking a menacing step towards her. "You are nothing. You were nothing before him, and you'll be nothing when he's gone." For a moment, the old fear flickered in Naomi's chest. The memory of his fists, of the pain, of her own helplessness. But then she looked at Theodore, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. And she looked back at Marcus, and she saw him for what he was. A small, pathetic man, his power nothing more than a cheap illusion built on the fear of others. And she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through his rage like a surgeon's scalpel. "You're wrong, Marcus. I was never nothing. You just needed me to be, so you could feel like you were something." Marcus lunged for her, his self-control completely gone. But he never reached her. Theodore's security guards, who had been waiting for the right moment, tackled him to the ground, pinning him to the expensive Persian rug. He thrashed and screamed, his threats and curses filling the opulent room. And as he was being subdued, the flashing blue and red lights of police cars filled the long driveway. Arthur Sinclair had already made the call. It was all over. Naomi stood there, watching as the man who had tormented her for a decade was handcuffed and dragged out of the house, still shouting her name. She didn't feel triumph, not yet. Just a profound, shuddering sense of release. The monster was finally being caged. The aftermath was swift and total. With the evidence compiled by Theodore's investigators, the district attorney had an open and shut case. Marcus Vance was charged not only with assault and breaking and entering, but with multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The story became a media sensation, the abusive stepfather, the heroic janitor, and the benevolent billionaire. Marcus's carefully constructed world came crashing down in a storm of public disgrace. His friends abandoned him, his business partners cut all ties, and his name became synonymous with greed and cruelty. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison, his arrogance and rage finally silenced by the cold, hard reality of a prison cell. And what of Cheryl? With Marcus's assets frozen and her name tarnished by association, she was left with nothing. The house was seized, the accounts emptied. She was forced to move into a tiny, run-down apartment, the kind of place she had always looked down upon with disdain. One day, she showed up at the gates of the Hawthorne estate, looking frail and defeated. She begged to see Naomi. Against his better judgment, Theodore allowed it, but Naomi met her at the gate. She would not let her mother back into her sanctuary. Cheryl cried, a storm of self-pity and regret. "I'm sorry, Naomi," she wept. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. He had everything." Naomi listened, her expression unreadable. She felt a flicker of the old pity, the old sense of daughterly duty. But then she remembered the sight of her mother, standing still and silent by the kitchen counter as her daughter's bones were being broken. "You didn't know what to do, Mom," Naomi said, her voice quiet but firm. "You could have helped me. You could have called the police. You could have said stop. You did nothing. And doing nothing was a choice. You chose him over me. Now you have to live with that choice." She turned and walked away, back up the long driveway, without looking back. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was also the most necessary. She was finally, truly, free. In the years that followed, Naomi blossomed. Theodore, seeing her sharp mind and compassionate heart, made her the executive director of his new philanthropic venture, the Hawthorne Foundation for Survivors, a charity dedicated to helping victims of domestic abuse escape their situations and rebuild their lives. She poured her heart into the work, her own experience giving her a unique and profound understanding of the people she was helping. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a beacon of hope for others. She and Theodore became family. He was the father she had lost, and she was the daughter he had never had. The grand estate, once a symbol of a life she could never have, became her home, filled not with fear and silence, but with laughter, purpose, and love. The story of Naomi Clarke became a quiet legend in the city, a reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in courage. That true strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how resiliently you can heal. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing in the world is a single act of kindness, performed in the darkest of alleys, by a person who has every reason to give up but chooses, instead, to save a life, and in doing so, saves her own. If her story teaches us anything, it's that the deepest wounds can lead to the greatest strengths, and that the quietest people often have the most powerful stories to tell. And for anyone out there feeling trapped or broken, remember Naomi. Remember that even on the cold, hard floor, there is always a reason to get back up.